An act of blatant racism at airport security causes a black man to miss his flight, but what happens next will leave you speechless. The cuffs tightened around David's wrists as the crowd stared, phones recording every second. A civil rights lawyer, treated like a threat, all because of the color of his skin. The humiliation? Just the beginning. What unfolded next would challenge a corrupt system, exposing truth some would do anything to hide. Justice wasn't just delayed. It was ready to be redefined. But how did David turn the tables in a case that shocked the nation? And what secret evidence tipped the scales in his favor? Find out in the story that changed everything. Let's stick around to find out. But before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from today. If you enjoy this tale, don't forget to subscribe. The rhythmic click of David Carter's Oxford shoes echoed through Chicago O'Hare International Airport's polished floors, matching the determined beat of his heart. His reflection caught his eye as he passed the floor-to-ceiling windows. A sharply dressed black man in his early 30s, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that spoke of both success and careful attention to detail. The leather briefcase in his right hand contained documents that could change lives. Tomorrow's discrimination lawsuit against one of Chicago's largest corporations. Gate C23, he muttered to himself, checking his watch for the third time in as many minutes. The airport buzzed with its usual chaos. Children trailing behind harried parents, business travelers glued to their phones, and the occasional burst of announcements echoing through the terminal. But David moved with purpose, weaving through the crowd with practiced ease. Time wasn't just money today. It was justice. The Henderson case had taken 18 months of preparation, countless late nights, and more coffee than he cared to remember. Missing tomorrow's court appearance wasn't an option. His clients, 3 black employees systematically passed over for promotion, were counting on him. The security checkpoint loomed ahead, a familiar obstacle course of belt bins and body scanners. David had this down to a science. Laptop out, belt off, shoes in the bin. He'd done this dance hundreds of times before, yet something felt different today. Maybe it was the way Agent Sullivan's eyes followed him from the moment he joined the line. A gaze that carried weight beyond mere observation. David pushed the thought aside. As a black man in America, he was used to being watched. It came with the territory, like the extra locks on his door and the careful way he kept his hands visible during traffic stops. He focused instead on his routine, placing his belongings in the gray bins with methodical precision. "Sir," Agent Sullivan's voice cut through the ambient noise. "Step aside for additional screening." David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he maintained his professional demeanor. "Of course," he replied, watching as other passengers, mostly white, mostly in a hurry, streamed past with barely a glance from security. A younger agent stood nearby, Emma Grant, according to her nameplate. She shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between David and her colleague as Sullivan began his routine check. Purpose of travel? Sullivan's tone carried an edge that set David's nerves on alert. "Business. I have a court appearance tomorrow morning." "What kind of business?" "I'm an attorney." Sullivan's eyebrows raised a fraction, skepticism evident in his expression. "An attorney?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. David felt the familiar burn of indignation rising in his chest but kept his voice steady. "Yes, I'm a civil rights lawyer with Matthews and Associates." He reached for his bar card, but Sullivan waved it away. "That's not necessary. Spread your arms and legs, please." As Sullivan's pat-down grew increasingly thorough, David noticed Emma's discomfort growing. She busied herself with other passengers, but her attention kept returning to the scene unfolding before her. "Is there a problem, Agent Sullivan?" David finally asked, his patience wearing thin as the minutes ticked by. "Just doing my job, sir." Sullivan's response was clipped, almost challenging. "We have protocols to follow." "Protocols that seem to apply selectively," David observed quietly, noting how a white executive in a similar suit had breezed through moments earlier with barely a second glance. Sullivan's eyes narrowed. "If you have a complaint about our security procedures, you're welcome to file it. But right now, I need you to comply without further comment." The tension in the air thickened. Other travelers began to stare, some with sympathy, others with the all-too-familiar look of people who'd already made up their minds about what they were seeing. David felt their eyes on him, each gaze adding weight to his shoulders. He'd been here before. Not this exact situation, but countless variations of it. Each time, the same choice presented itself: react and fulfill their expectations, or maintain composure and document everything for later. As a civil rights attorney, he knew which path would lead to change. "Of course, Agent Sullivan," David replied, his voice carrying a calm that belied the storm brewing inside him. "I always comply with lawful requests from authority figures. It's part of my professional ethics." The subtle emphasis on lawful wasn't lost on Sullivan, whose face hardened almost imperceptibly. As David stood there, arms still raised, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than a random security check. This was about power, about putting someone in their place. And David Carter was no stranger to that game. What Sullivan didn't know was that he'd picked the wrong person to target today. David had spent his career fighting exactly this kind of abuse of power, and as he stood there under Sullivan's scrutiny, his mind was already cataloging every detail, every witness, every procedural violation. This wasn't going to be just another day at the airport after all. It was about to become something much bigger, a battle that would test not just David's legal skills, but his resolve to fight for justice, even when he himself became the victim. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Agent Sullivan led David to a small screening area adjacent to the main security checkpoint. The space felt deliberately claustrophobic, with its stark white walls and single metal table. David's briefcase sat unopened on the table's surface, a silent reminder of the court appearance slipping further away with each passing minute. "So, Mr. Carter," Sullivan began, emphasizing the Mr. With subtle mockery, "you say you're an attorney. That must be quite lucrative." His eyes traveled over David's expensive suit and designer watch. "What's your annual income?" David met Sullivan's gaze steadily. "I fail to see how my income is relevant to airport security. Just establishing your profile, sir." Sullivan's pen tapped rhythmically against his notepad. "Traveling alone today? No colleagues? No. Family?" "I've already explained my purpose for travel," David replied, his voice maintaining its professional tone despite the growing knot of tension in his stomach. "I have a court appearance tomorrow morning in Chicago. Time-sensitive matter." Sullivan circled David slowly, like a predator sizing up its prey. "Interesting that a lawyer of your caliber would be traveling alone. No paralegal? No support staff?" The implications hung heavy in the air. David felt his jaw tighten, but kept his composure. Years of courtroom experience had taught him the power of controlled responses. "Agent Sullivan, let's be direct. Would you be asking these questions if I were white?" The room temperature seemed to drop several degrees. Sullivan's face hardened, his previous pretense of professional courtesy evaporating. "You're acting suspiciously, Mr. Carter. Your attitude isn't helping your situation." "My attitude?" David's eyebrow raised slightly. "I've been nothing but cooperative while you've conducted what appears to be a racially motivated interrogation." From her position near the door, Emma Grant shifted uncomfortably. "Sir," she ventured, addressing Sullivan, "we've completed the standard screening protocols. Perhaps we should." "Agent Grant," Sullivan cut her off sharply, "if you can't handle this situation, you're dismissed. I'll note in your evaluation that you need additional training in suspicious subject protocols." Emma's face flushed, but she remained at her post, her eyes now fixed on the floor. David noticed her hands trembling slightly, a detail he filed away for later. "I'd like to speak to your supervisor," David stated firmly, reaching for his phone. "I believe I have the right to make that request." Sullivan's hand shot out, blocking David's movement. "Phones aren't permitted during secondary screening. Put your hands where I can see them." "This is absurd," David said, his voice rising slightly. "I'm going to miss my flight, and you haven't given me a single valid reason for this detention." "Hands? Where? I can see them." Sullivan emphasized each word, already reaching for his handcuffs. "Your continued non-compliance leaves me no choice but to detain you for further questioning." "Non-compliance?" David's incredulity was evident. "I've followed every instruction, answered every question. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around David's wrists before he could finish his sentence. The sound echoed in the small room, final and damning. "You have the right to remain silent," Sullivan began, a hint of satisfaction creeping into his voice. "Anything you say can and will be used against you." As Sullivan led David through the terminal, the crowd parted like water around them. David held his head high, even as he felt the weight of countless stares. Business travelers paused their phone calls. Parents pulled their children closer. Phones emerged to record the scene. "They're always causing trouble," a woman's voice carried clearly through the hushed whispers. "If they just comply with authority." David's steps never faltered, but something shifted inside him. This wasn't just about missing a flight anymore. This wasn't even about him. This was about every person who'd ever been profiled, every random security check that wasn't random at all, every silent witness who looked away. As they approached the detention area, David caught his reflection in a window. Shoulders back, chin up, dignity intact despite the handcuffs. He was no longer just an attorney headed to court. He had become something else, a test case, a catalyst, a challenge to the system itself. And Agent Sullivan had no idea what he just set in motion. The security doors closed behind them with a heavy thud, sealing David into what would become the longest night of his professional life, and the beginning of a battle that would echo far beyond the walls of O'Hare International Airport. The interrogation room was a study in institutional minimalism. For bare walls, a metal table bolted to the floor, and two chairs that seemed designed for discomfort. The fluorescent light above buzzed incessantly, its harsh glare reflecting off the stark white walls. David Carter sat perfectly still, his wrists raw from the handcuffs that bound him to the table. Time moved differently in this windowless box. It could have been minutes or hours since they brought him here. The only sound was the steady rhythm of his breathing as he employed the meditation techniques that had gotten him through countless high-pressure court situations. Inhale for 4 counts. Hold for 7. Exhale for 8. Control the breath. Control the mind. "Don't let anger cloud your judgment," he whispered to himself, recalling his mentor's words from law school. "Anger makes you reactive. Strategic thinking makes you effective." The door opened with a metallic groan, and Agent Sullivan strode in, carrying David's briefcase like a trophy. His swagger spoke of a man who believed he held all the cards. He dropped the briefcase on the table with a theatrical thud. "Well, Mr. Attorney," Sullivan drawled, emphasizing the title with mock respect, "shall we discuss your interesting collection of documents?" David sat straighter, his voice steady and clear. "That briefcase contains privileged attorney-client communications. Opening it without a warrant would constitute a serious violation of—" "Save the legal lecture," Sullivan cut him off, smirking. "Your fancy degree doesn't make you above the rules. We have broad authority when it comes to security threats." "Security threats?" David's eyebrow raised slightly. "Please, elaborate on how a civil rights attorney traveling to a court appearance constitutes a security threat." Sullivan began pacing, his shoes clicking against the linoleum floor. "Let's talk about your attitude, Mr. Carter. Your hostility during a routine security check. Your reluctance to answer simple questions about your travel." "My attitude?" David's laugh was hollow. "I've been nothing but professional while being subjected to blatant racial profiling. We both know why I'm here, Agent Sullivan, and it has nothing to do with security protocols." Sullivan's face darkened. He leaned forward, palms flat on the table. "Playing the race card already? Typical. You people always want to make everything about race." "You people?" David's voice carried a dangerous calm. "Would you care to clarify that statement for the record? I'm sure it would make an interesting addition to my complaint to the Department of Homeland Security's Civil Rights Office." The threat hung in the air between them. Sullivan's smugness wavered for a moment before his face hardened again. "Are you threatening a federal agent, Mr. Carter?" "Not at all," David replied, his eyes never leaving Sullivan's. "I'm simply informing you that you've severely underestimated me. This isn't going to end the way you think it will." Sullivan laughed, but there was a note of uncertainty in it now. "People like you don't scare me, Carter. I've been doing this job for 15 years. You're not the first to make threats." "This isn't a threat," David said softly. "It's a promise. Every minute you keep me here, every civil right you violate, every biased word you utter, it's all building a case. A case that will ensure you never abuse your authority again." Sullivan's face flushed red. "We'll see about that." He grabbed the briefcase and headed for the door. "Enjoy your stay, Mr. Attorney. We'll continue this conversation when you've had time to adjust your attitude." As the door slammed shut, David closed his eyes, his mind already racing through legal precedents and procedural violations. Sullivan thought he was dealing with just another angry black man he could intimidate into submission. Instead, he'd handed a civil rights attorney exactly the case he needed to challenge systemic abuse of power. David flexed his wrists in the handcuffs, feeling the metal bite into his skin. Each moment of discomfort, each violation of his rights, each racist undertone in Sullivan's words, all of it was evidence. All of it would serve a greater purpose. This wasn't just about making his court appearance anymore. It wasn't even about his personal dignity. This had become something larger. A chance to expose the casual racism that lurked behind badges and uniforms, the institutional bias that hid behind protocols and procedures. As the fluorescent light continued its relentless buzz overhead, David began mentally drafting his lawsuit. Sullivan had no idea, but he'd just become the perfect defendant in a case that would shake the very foundations of airport security protocols. The game was about to change, and David Carter was ready to play for keeps. The evening air hit David's face like a splash of cold water as he finally emerged from O'Hare's security area. His wrists bore angry red marks from the handcuffs, and his once crisp suit was wrinkled from hours of detention. The terminal's large windows revealed a dark sky. His flight to Chicago had long since departed. "Mr. Carter," airport administrator in a pressed blue blazer approached him. "We sincerely apologize for any inconvenience. We've booked you on tomorrow morning's first flight, complimentary of course." David's laugh was bitter. "Inconvenience? Is that what we're calling racial profiling and unlawful detention now?" He checked his phone, which had been returned to him along with his other belongings. 17 missed calls, 32 text messages, and an email from the Chicago courthouse expressing concern about his absence. The administrator shifted uncomfortably. "If you'd like to file a formal complaint—" "Oh, I'll be doing much more than that," David interrupted. His voice steady despite his exhaustion. He straightened his tie, a small gesture of dignity in the face of humiliation. The drive home was a blur of streetlights and racing thoughts. David used his car's voice recorder to capture every detail while it was fresh in his mind. Sullivan's exact words, the timestamps of each interaction, the witnesses present. He particularly focused on Emigrant's reactions, her visible discomfort, her attempted intervention, the way Sullivan had threatened her evaluation. By the time he reached his apartment, it was past midnight. Sleep was out of the question. Instead, David sat at his desk, opened his laptop, and began typing. Every detail mattered: the angle of Sullivan's body language, the specific questions asked, the other passengers who'd passed through security without scrutiny. He described the cold metal of the handcuffs, the fluorescent buzz of the interrogation room, the whispered comments from onlookers. At 7 a.m., David walked into Matthews and Associates, where Sofia Alvarez was already waiting in his office. Her dark eyes blazed with fury as he recounted the events. "Dios mío," she muttered, pacing the room. "They really haven't learned anything, have they? Even after all the sensitivity training, all the diversity initiatives?" She stopped suddenly, turning to face him. "We're filing suit. Today." David nodded, pulling up his detailed account. "I want to go after the whole system, Sophia, not just Sullivan. The policies that enable this behavior, the culture that protects it, the institutional racism that perpetuates it," Sophia finished. She was already pulling up relevant cases on her tablet. "We can establish a pattern. This isn't the first time O'Hare Security has been accused of profiling." "There's something else," David said, leaning forward. "That young agent, Emigrant. She tried to intervene. Sullivan threatened her career for it, but she still showed moral courage. She could be crucial to our case." Sophia's eyes lit up with understanding. A witness from inside the system. Someone who can testify to the culture of discrimination. I'll find out everything about her: employment history, incident reports, performance reviews. Be careful how you approach her, David cautioned. Sullivan seems like the vindictive type. We need to protect her if she's willing to help us. Their strategy session was interrupted by David's phone buzzing. His secretary's voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Carter, there's a reporter from the Chicago Tribune on line 1. They're asking about an incident at O'Hare yesterday. Someone posted a video online." David and Sophia exchanged glances. The video could be damaging or helpful, depending on what it showed and how it was framed. "This is going to get ugly fast," Sophia warned. "Good," David replied, reaching for the phone. "Sometimes things need to get ugly before they can get better." He paused, his hand on the receiver. "Sullivan wanted to teach me my place yesterday. Instead, he's about to learn about justice." The phone kept ringing, a persistent reminder that what had started as a personal humiliation was about to become a very public battle. David took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and prepared to take the first step in what he knew would be a long and difficult fight. The media spotlight was about to shine on O'Hare's security practices, and David Carter was ready to ensure it illuminated every dark corner of institutional racism hiding behind the badge of authority. The conference room at Matthews and Associates had transformed into a war room. Papers covered every surface: airport security manuals, TSA guidelines, civil rights precedents, and surveillance footage screenshots. David and Sophia had been working for 16 hours straight, fueled by coffee and determination. "Look at this," Sophia said, highlighting a passage in the security manual. Section 4. 3 states that additional screening must be based on specific, articulable facts. Sullivan had nothing. He was fishing. David nodded, adding another note to their growing case file. "And here's the pattern. I've found 7 complaints in the past year alone. All minorities, all subjected to random, additional screening. The statistical probability of this being random is practically 0. Their preliminary lawsuit was taking shape: racial profiling, unlawful detention, violation of civil rights, abuse of authority, and emotional distress. Each charge was meticulously documented, each allegation supported by policy violations and witness statements. "We need Emma's testimony," Sophia said quietly. "She's the crack in their wall of silence." 2 days later, in a quiet coffee shop far from O'Hare, Emma Grant sat across from Sophia, nervously turning her cup in her hands. She'd chosen a location in the suburbs, away from any chance of running into her colleagues. "I could lose my job for this," Emma whispered, her eyes darting to the door every time it opened. "But what happened that day? It wasn't right. It wasn't protocol." "Tell me about Sullivan," Sophia prompted gently, her recorder discreetly capturing every word. Emma's hands trembled slightly. "He has a pattern. He calls it intuition, but it's profiling, plain and simple. Anyone who questions it gets labeled as soft or unsuited for security work. He's ruined careers over it." "Why did you try to intervene that day?" Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Because I couldn't stay silent anymore. Mr. Carter was completely professional, completely compliant. Sullivan was the one escalating, looking for any excuse. I've seen him do it before, but this time..." She took a deep breath. "This time I have proof." Sophia leaned forward. "Proof?" Emma reached into her bag and pulled out a USB drive. "I've been keeping records. Dates, times, patterns of selective screening. And I'm not the only one. There are others who want to come forward but are afraid." The plot twist they needed had just fallen into their laps. Emma wasn't just a witness. She was a whistleblower with documentation. "I'll testify," Emma said firmly, her voice stronger now. "Sullivan's actions weren't just excessive. They were deliberately discriminatory. And I can prove it." The news of the lawsuit broke the next morning. The Chicago Tribune ran it as their lead story: "Civil rights attorney sues O'Hare Security for racial profiling." Social media exploded with opinions. The video of David's detention had gone viral, sparking heated debates about security, race, and power. Support flooded in from civil rights organizations, community leaders, and other victims of profiling. But with it came the backlash. David's email inbox filled with messages. "Stop playing the race card. You're making our airports less safe. People like you are the real problem. David forwarded each message to their evidence file, documenting the broader context of racial attitudes their case would have to address. Then came the email that made even his seasoned legal mind pause. Drop the case now. We know where you live. We know where you work. Some people need to learn their place the hard way. This is your only warning. David stared at the screen, his jaw set. They had anticipated resistance, but threats of violence raised the stakes significantly. His phone buzzed. Sophia had received a copy of the email. David, her voice was tense. We need to talk about security measures. This just got real. He looked out his office window at the Chicago skyline, the same view he'd worked so hard to earn. The threat was meant to make him back down, to remind him of his place. Instead, it had the opposite effect. Forward it to digital forensics, he replied calmly. Every threat they make is another piece of evidence. They think they're fighting one lawyer. They're about to learn they're fighting a movement. As he ended the call, David realized there was no turning back now. The case had evolved beyond airport security policies. It had become a battle for the soul of American justice itself, and he was ready for war. The federal district court in Chicago hummed with tension on the trial's opening day. Every bench was filled. Civil rights activists, airport security personnel, media representatives, and concerned citizens all packed together in the historic courtroom. The air felt electric with anticipation. James Morrison, the airport's lead counsel, stood before the jury with practiced confidence. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his voice smooth as polished marble. This case is about security, not discrimination. Agent Sullivan, a decorated officer with 15 years of experience, followed standard protocols when faced with suspicious behavior. Morrison painted a different picture of that day. One where David was argumentative, uncooperative, and potentially threatening. Mr. Carter's own actions triggered the additional screening. His profession doesn't place him above standard security measures that keep all Americans safe. When David took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. He sat straight-backed in his tailored suit, every inch the accomplished attorney, yet there was something vulnerable in his expression as he began to speak. I've spent my career in courtrooms like this one, he began, his voice steady. I've argued before judges, challenged corporations, and fought for justice. But on that day at O'Hare, none of that mattered. In Agent Sullivan's eyes, I wasn't a lawyer heading to court. I was just another black man who needed to be put in his place. David recounted every detail, the initial stares, the random selection, the escalating hostility. His words carried the weight of not just his experience, but countless similar stories. Even Morrison's attempts to paint David as combative during cross-examination fell flat against his dignified responses. Then came Emma Grant's testimony. She walked to the stand with visible nervousness, but spoke with quiet determination. Agent Sullivan has a pattern, she testified, her voice growing stronger. He calls it professional intuition, but I've documented every random selection for the past year. The data shows clear racial bias. She presented her records, dates, times, racial demographics of those selected for additional screening. The numbers were damning. The day Mr. Carter was detained, Emma continued, Sullivan violated at least 7 different protocols. When I tried to intervene, he threatened my career. This wasn't about security. It was about power and prejudice. The trial's turning point came during Sullivan's cross-examination. Sophia Alvarez approached him with deceptive gentleness. Agent Sullivan, could you explain exactly what made Mr. Carter suspicious? Sullivan sat forward, seemingly eager to justify his actions. His attitude was confrontational. Before or after you selected him for additional screening? He was evasive about his travel. The court records show he immediately stated his purpose and destination. What else made him suspicious? Sullivan's composure cracked. Look, when you've been doing this job as long as I have, you develop instincts about certain types of people. Certain types? Sophia pounced. Could you elaborate on what types you mean, Agent Sullivan? His response was defensive, aggressive. People who think they're above the rules, who play the race card whenever they're questioned, who? No further questions, Sophia cut him off. leaving Sullivan's bias hanging in the air like smoke. The defense team huddled in urgent whispers. Their case was unraveling. Sullivan had revealed exactly what they tried to hide, the underlying prejudice that had driven his actions. As the day's session ended, David caught fragments of conversation from the jury as they filed out. Did you hear what he said about certain types? Those statistics don't lie. If this happened to a lawyer, imagine. Morrison approached David outside the courtroom, his earlier confidence gone. We should discuss settlement options, he began. David shook his head. This was never about money. This is about changing the system. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters shouting questions, but David's mind was already on tomorrow's session. The cracks in the defense's case weren't just showing, they were breaking wide open. Justice, so long delayed, was finally within reach. The tension in the courtroom was palpable as the jury filed back in after 3 days of deliberation. David sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the table before him, while Sophia gripped her pen so tightly her knuckles had turned white. The only sound was the soft rustle of fabric as the packed gallery leaned forward in anticipation. Has the jury reached a verdict? Judge Martinez's voice carried clearly through the hushed courtroom. The forewoman stood, her voice steady. We have, Your Honor. Time seemed to slow as she unfolded the paper. David thought of every person who had ever faced discrimination in silence, every individual who had swallowed their dignity in the name of security theater. This moment was for all of them. In the matter of Carter versus O'Hare International Airport Security Division, we find in favor of the plaintiff. The courtroom erupted in muffled gasps and whispers. David remained still, his expression unchanged, as the forewoman continued reading. We award compensatory damages in the amount of $850,000 and punitive damages in the amount of $5 million. She paused, then continued with the jury's unprecedented additional recommendation. Furthermore, we strongly urge the implementation of comprehensive reforms in airport security protocols, including mandatory bias training, independent oversight of screening procedures, and transparent reporting of demographic data for all additional screenings. Judge Martinez nodded gravely before turning to address the court. Her words cut through the tension like a blade. Agent Sullivan, she began, fixing him with a stern gaze. Your actions represent a disturbing abuse of authority and a clear pattern of racial discrimination. This court finds your testimony not only unconvincing but deeply troubling in its revelation of systemic bias. Sullivan sat rigid in his chair, his face ashen. The judge wasn't finished. To the O'Hare International Airport Security Division, this verdict should serve as a wake-up call. The practice of using professional intuition as a cover for racial profiling ends today. This court will be monitoring your compliance with the jury's recommended reforms. Outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the steps as reporters surged forward, microphones extended. Camera lights blazed as David stepped up to the podium, Sophia at his side. Today's verdict is not just a victory for me, but a victory for justice itself. What happened at O'Hare Airport that day was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a deeper problem that persists across our nation. A problem where the color of one's skin still determines how they are treated by those in authority. But today, we've shown that change is possible, that accountability exists, that no badge, no uniform, no position of power grants immunity from the fundamental principles of justice and equality. To every person who has ever been profiled, who has ever felt the sting of discrimination, who has ever been made to feel less than human because of their race, this verdict says you matter. Your dignity matters. Your rights matter. And to those who continue to abuse their authority, who hide behind protocols and procedures to justify their prejudices, hear this. The days of unchecked power are over. We will challenge you. We will expose you. And we will change the system, one case at a time. This victory is not the end. It's a beginning of real reform, real accountability, and real justice. Because justice isn't just a word, it's an action. And today, we took action. Thank you to the jury for their courage, to Emma Grant for her integrity, and to every person who stands up against discrimination, even when it seems impossible. Today proves that justice may be delayed, but it cannot be denied. The crowd erupted in applause as David finished speaking. News cameras flashed, capturing the moment for evening broadcasts across the country. But David's eyes were fixed on a group of young black law students standing at the edge of the crowd, their faces shining with tears and triumph. This was why he had fought so hard. Not just for himself, but for them, for their future, for their dignity, for their right to be treated with the same respect as anyone else. The verdict wasn't just a legal victory. It was a beacon of hope, a promise that change was possible. As the sun set over Chicago's skyline, David knew that tomorrow would bring new challenges. But today, justice had prevailed, and that made all the difference. The Chicago Tribune. Monday, March 15, 2025. Landmark racial profiling case leads to systemic changes at O'Hare. By Sarah Chen, Senior Justice Correspondent. Chicago. In the wake of last month's groundbreaking verdict in Carter v. O'Hare International Airport Security Division, sweeping changes are reshaping airport security protocols nationwide. The Transportation Security Administration, TSA, announced yesterday that Senior Agent James Sullivan has been terminated, marking the first of many reforms prompted by the high-profile case. This case has exposed deep-seated issues within our security infrastructure, said TSA Administrator Michael Rodriguez. We're implementing immediate changes to ensure our security measures protect all Americans while respecting their civil rights. Key changes include mandatory quarterly bias training for all security personnel, independent oversight committee to review screening procedures, monthly public reporting of demographic data for additional screenings, new whistleblower protection protocols. Attorney David Carter's victory has sparked similar lawsuits at airports across the country, with over 30 cases filed in the past week alone. Civil rights organizations report a surge in individuals coming forward with similar experiences of discrimination. This isn't just about one agent or one airport, said Carter in an exclusive interview. It's about transforming a system that too often confuses prejudice with protection. The case has garnered national attention, with several members of Congress calling for federal legislation to address racial profiling in security operations. David sat in his office, reading the Tribune article for the third time. The morning sun streamed through his window, illuminating the stack of letters and emails that had been pouring in since the verdict. Sullivan's firing should have felt like a victory, but David knew better. One agent's dismissal wouldn't solve systemic racism. His phone buzzed with another news alert. Airport security reform bill gains bipartisan support. Progress was happening, but change was a slow beast to wake. Emma Grant had been promoted to training coordinator, tasked with implementing new anti-bias protocols. She'd called yesterday, voice full of determination. We're changing things from the inside, David. It's slow, but it's real. Among the morning's mail, one letter stood out, handwritten on Northwestern Law School stationery. Dear Mr. Carter, my name is Marcus Washington, and I'm a first-year law student. I watched your case unfold while working as a security guard to pay for school. I've seen the kind of profiling you experienced, but never had the courage to speak up. Your victory showed me what's possible when someone refuses to back down. I've changed my focus to civil rights law. Someday, I hope to stand where you stood and fight for justice. Thank you for showing me the way. Sincerely, Marcus. David's throat tightened as he read the letter again. He thought of his younger self, of all the times he'd faced discrimination and stayed quiet, of the long journey that had led him to this moment. His office door opened, and Sophia walked in with fresh coffee and a determined smile. Ready for today? We've got 3 new cases to review. David looked at the photo on his wall, himself as a young law student, full of dreams and determination. Next to it hung a framed copy of the verdict, a testament to what those dreams could accomplish. You know, he said, standing to join Sophia at the conference table, someone once told me that justice is like a relay race. Each generation runs their lap, carries the baton as far as they can, then passes it on. He picked up the first case file, another incident of profiling, this time at a different airport. The fight was far from over, but the path forward was clearer now. Each case, each victory, each inspired young lawyer like Marcus was another step toward real change. The question isn't whether we'll achieve perfect justice in our lifetime, David said, opening the file. The question is whether we'll move the line forward for those who come after us. Sophia nodded, understanding in her eyes. Then let's move that line. Outside his window, Chicago bustled with morning energy. Somewhere in that city, Marcus Washington was sitting in a law class, dreaming of justice. Somewhere, another David Carter was facing discrimination, gathering the courage to fight back. And here, in this office, the next battle was beginning. David turned to the first page of the new case file. The work continued, as it always would, one case at a time, one step at a time, toward a future where justice truly meant justice for all.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.